The humidity on the island of Saipan in July of 1944 was not merely a weather condition, but a physical oppression that pressed down upon the lungs and the soul of every man in the United States Army, 27th Infantry Division. It was a cloying wet heat that smelled of rotting jungle vegetation and the sweet copper scent of blood that had been spilled in the weeks prior and never fully washed away by the tropical rains. In this suffocating atmosphere sat Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, a man who did not carry a rifle by trade, but rather the precision instruments of dental surgery. He was 30 years old, a graduate of the University of Southern California Dental College, and in the eyes of the grunts digging foxholes in the coral rock, he was a soft target, a man of comfort and fluoride in a world of steel and high explosives. To the hardened infantrymen of the 105th Infantry Regiment, Salomon was simply the dentist, a man necessary for a toothache, but irrelevant when the mortar rounds began to walk across the earth. They saw his clean hands and his officer insignia, and they assumed he knew nothing of the savage calculus of close-quarters combat. They assumed that because he had sworn an oath to heal, he lacked the capacity to destroy. They looked at his aid station situated just 50 yards behind the forward foxholes and saw a sanctuary of weakness, a place where the war was supposed to stop at the tent flaps. They were wrong. They did not understand that the precision required to drill into a nerve without causing agony is the same precision required to dismantle a human being piece by piece. They didn't know that beneath the medical tunic beat the heart of a predator waiting for the cage to break. And the cage was about to break in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The date was July 6th, turning into the early darkness of July 7th, 1944. The American forces believed the battle was all but won. The Japanese garrison, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had been pushed to the northern tip of the island, trapped against the sea, with nowhere to run and no hope of resupply. Intelligence reports circulated among the American command staff, suggesting that the enemy was broken, capable only of sporadic sniper fire and surrender. These reports were a fatal optimism, born of a misunderstanding of the Imperial Japanese Army. General Saito, old and sick and defeated, knew he had lost, but in the twisted code of Bushido, losing was not an end, but a transition to a final glorious act of destruction. In a cave carved into the rock of the Tanapag Plain, Saito issued his final order. It wasn't an order to retreat. It was not an order to surrender. It was an order for Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. Every man able to walk, every man able to crawl. Every man who could hold a sharpened bamboo stick or a rock was to charge. There would be no prisoners. There would be no stopping. It was to be the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War, a tidal wave of flesh and hate aimed directly at the seam in the American lines, where Benjamin Salomon was checking the inventory of morphine syrettes and bandages. 3,000 to 4,000 Japanese soldiers gathered in the darkness. They were starving skeletons, with skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes burning with the fanaticism of men who have already accepted their own deaths. They were not fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for the spiritual purity of annihilation. Among them were the walking wounded men with gangrenous limbs, men blinded by shrapnel men who hobbled on crutches. They did not carry standard infantry weapons alone. Some had Type 99 Arisaka rifles with the chrysanthemum crest of the Emperor stamped on the receiver. Others carried light machine guns stripped from wrecked aircraft, but many carried only bayonets tied to sticks or knives or simply their own teeth and fingernails. They moved into position with the silence of ghosts slipping through the tall kunai grass that swayed in the night breeze. The American perimeter was quiet. The sentries peered into the gloom, but the jungle plays tricks on the eyes and the mind. The crickets chirped, and the wind rustled, and beneath those natural sounds was the rhythmic breathing of thousands of men waiting for the signal to sprint into the mouth of hell. Captain Salomon was inside his aid station, a canvas tent that smelled of antiseptic and sweat. He was tending to the wounded from the previous days, skirmishes, changing dressings, and administering painkillers. He was tired. His eyes were gritty with lack of sleep. He had no idea that less than a football field away a force of nature was coiling to strike him. He was a man of science, surrounded by superstition and violence, and he believed that the red cross on his tent was a shield. He believed that even in war, there were rules that civilized men followed. He was about to learn that on Saipan, civilization had been gutted and left to rot in the sun. The attack did not begin with a single shot, but with a sound that survivors would later describe as the earth itself screaming. It was a guttural roar from thousands of throats, a cacophony of bonsai screamed in unison that shattered the stillness of the morning. Then came the mortar shells, falling like hail, cracking open the coral, and sending jagged shrapnel tearing through the air. The American front line dissolved instantly. The first wave of the Japanese attack hit the foxholes of the 1st and 2nd battalions like a sledgehammer hitting a pane of glass. Men were bayoneted in their sleep. Machine gun nests were overrun by sheer weight of numbers, the bodies of the enemy piling up so high they blocked the fields of fire. The perimeter collapsed. The flood of gray and green uniforms poured through the gap, flowing uncontrollably toward the rear areas, toward the artillery positions, toward the command posts, and directly toward the forward aid station of Captain Benjamin Salomon. Inside the tent, the roar of the battle was muffled, but unmistakably close. The ground shook. Dust filtered down from the canvas ceiling, coating the open wounds of the patients. Salomon looked up from a patient, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, something was terribly efficiently wrong. This was not a skirmish. This was a deluge. He stepped to the flap of the tent and looked out. The world had gone mad. The dawn light was choked with smoke, and the tracers of machine gun fire cut through the haze like angry hornets. He saw American soldiers running not in an orderly retreat, but in a panic, their eyes wide with the terror of men who have seen the devil. And behind them came the horde, a wall of screaming humanity moving with a singular purpose. Salomon turned back to his patients. There were over 30 wounded men in the station, some unconscious, some barely clinging to life. They could not run. They could not fight. They were his responsibility. The Hippocratic oath echoed in his mind, "Do no harm." But as he looked at the helplessness of the men on the stretchers, a cold realization settled over him. To do no harm to these men, he would have to inflict massive, catastrophic harm on the men coming to kill them. The dentist was about to perform the most violent surgery of his life. The first Japanese soldier burst into the tent not 2 minutes later. He was a vision of nightmare. His uniform tattered his face, a mask of grime and madness. He held a bayonet that was dark with fresh blood. He did not look at Salomon. He looked at the nearest stretcher, where a young American private lay sedated and helpless. The Japanese soldier raised the bayonet high, screaming an unintelligible cry of triumph, preparing to plunge the steel into the chest of the defenseless boy. This was the moment the heresy began. This was the moment Benjamin Salomon shed the skin of the healer and revealed the killer underneath. There was no hesitation, no philosophical debate in his mind. The rules of war said a doctor was a non-combatant. The reality of Saipan said a doctor was a man standing between a monster and a victim. Salomon reached out not for a scalpel, but for an M1 Garand rifle that had been leaning against a crate of supplies. The M1 Garand is a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle chambered for the .30 caliber cartridge. It is a heavy weapon made of walnut wood and machined steel, fed by an 8-round en-bloc clip. It is not a surgical instrument. It is a tool designed to punch holes in human beings at 500 yards, but in the confined space of the medical tent, it was a club, a spear, and a cannon all at once. Salomon did not fire. The distance was too short, and the risk of hitting the patient was too high. Instead, he lunged. The dentist who had spent his career making microscopic adjustments to dental bridges now moved with the brute force of a linebacker. He slammed the butt of the heavy rifle into the Japanese soldier's midsection, folding him in half. As the enemy soldier gasped for air, Salomon reversed the weapon, bringing the steel butt plate down onto the man's skull with a sickening crack. The intruder collapsed, his war cry silenced forever. But there was no time to breathe. Another enemy soldier appeared at the entrance, his eyes locking onto Salomon. This one carried a rifle, and he raised it to fire. Salomon reacted with a speed that defied his training. He leveled the Garand at the hip. The safety was already off. He pulled the trigger. The rifle roared in the enclosed space, the sound deafening, the muzzle flash blinding. The .30 caliber bullet struck the second soldier in the chest, throwing him backward out of the tent, as if he had been yanked by a cable. The brass casing ejected with a metallic ping ringing off the medical equipment. But they kept coming. 2 more soldiers rushed in, stepping over the body of their fallen comrade. They were frenzied, wanting only to spill American blood. They ignored the armed dentist and lunged for the wounded. Salomon dropped the rifle, which was now empty, or jammed. He did not check. He grabbed a bayonet, a long piece of triangular steel that lay on a table intended to be used for cutting thick bandages. He became a whirlwind of violence. He stabbed the 3rd soldier, driving the blade deep into the attacker's abdomen, twisting it, as he had been taught in basic training, seeking the vital organs with the anatomical knowledge of a medical professional. The man screamed and fell. The 4th soldier swung a knife, slicing Salomon's arm, but the dentist did not feel the pain. Adrenaline flooded his system, turning his blood into liquid fire. He headbutted the 4th man, stunning him, then kicked him in the knee, shattering the joint before finishing him with the bayonet. 4 dead men lay on the floor of his aid station. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and bowels. Salomon stood, panting, his white medical tunic splattered with red. He looked at his shaking hands. They were covered in blood that was not his patient's. It was the blood of the enemy. The heresy was complete. He had violated the sanctity of his station to save it. But outside, the roar of the battle was getting louder. The 4 men were just the scouts. The army was coming. He realized then that the rifle and the bayonet were not enough. 1 man with a semi-automatic rifle could not stop a tidal wave. He needed something more. He needed a force multiplier. He needed to turn the air itself into lead. He stepped out of the tent into the chaos of the dawn. The American lines were dissolving around him. Men were running past, dropping their weapons, screaming that they were overrun. But Salomon did not run. His eyes scanned the perimeter looking for an answer, and he saw it. A machine gun position just outside the tent. The crew was dead, slumped over the weapon, their bodies riddled with shrapnel. But the gun was still there. It was a Browning model, 1917. A 1 heavy machine gun, a water-cooled beast of a weapon mounted on a tripod, capable of firing continuously for hours if fed properly. It weighed over 40 pounds, without the water and the ammunition. It fired the same .30 caliber round as the rifle, but it fired them at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. It was a weapon designed to dominate space, to create a zone of death where nothing could live. It was the antithesis of everything Benjamin Salomon had studied in dental school. It was a machine of industrial slaughter, and it was the only thing that stood between his patients and the massacre. Salomon ran to the gun. He dragged the body of the dead gunner aside his hands, slipping in the gore. He checked the feed tray. There was a belt of ammunition loaded. He checked the water jacket. It was full. He grabbed the spade grips, the heavy steel handles that controlled the weapon. He was alone. A machine gun is a crew-served weapon. It requires a gunner to fire an assistant gunner to feed the ammunition and manage the belt and ammunition bearers to keep the supply flowing. Salomon had none of these. He was a one-man army, a dentist trying to operate a weapon that required a squad. But he understood mechanics. He understood how parts fit together, how springs and levers worked in unison. He racked the charging handle, hearing the heavy clunk of the bolt engaging. He swiveled the gun on its tripod, traversing left and right, checking his field of fire. The Japanese were emerging from the smoke, an endless stream of targets, running, screaming, charging with bayonets fixed. They saw the lone figure at the gun. They saw the medical insignia. They probably thought he was a fool, a desperate man trying to work a weapon he didn't understand. They were about to learn the error of that assumption. Salomon settled his thumbs onto the butterfly trigger. He took a breath, inhaling the smoke and the death. He was no longer a doctor. He was no longer a dentist. He was the guardian of the gate. He squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared to life, a rhythmic, thumping thunder that shook his entire body. The brass casings began to pile up around his feet, like gold coins. The belt danced and jittered as the rounds were sucked into the chamber. Downrange, the effect was immediate and terrible. The lead spray cut into the front rank of the Japanese charge. Men disintegrated. Bodies were thrown backward, torn apart by the high-velocity impacts. Salomon did not fire wildly. He fired in controlled bursts, traversing the gun with a steady hand, walking the fire into the clusters of enemy soldiers. He watched the impacts, watching the pink mist spray into the air, noting the efficiency of the destruction with a detached, clinical observation. He was calm now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. He knew he was going to die. There was no way he was leaving this position alive. The enemy was too numerous. The retreat was too far gone. But he had bought time. Every second he held the trigger was a second his patience could use to crawl away. Every Japanese soldier he cut down was one less monster reaching the rear lines. He was trading his life for theirs, a transaction he accepted without regret. He shouted orders to the wounded inside the tent, telling them to move to get back to the regimental command post while he held the door. He was their shepherd, and this machine gun was his staff. The barrel of the Browning began to heat up the water in the jacket, starting to boil. Steam hissed from the relief valve. The belt ran dry. Salomon didn't panic. He scrambled to the ammo crates, tearing open a new box with bleeding fingers. He lifted the heavy cloth belt, aligning the rounds into the feedway, slamming the cover down, racking the handle again. The Japanese had taken cover, shocked by the volume of fire coming from the single position. They regrouped, yelling commands, shifting their attack to flank him. They realized this was not a weak point. This was a hornet's nest. They began to focus their fire on him. Bullets snapped past his head, tearing through the canvas of the tent behind him. Dirt kicked up into his face. But Salomon kept firing. He adjusted his aim, targeting the officers, targeting the machine gunners, setting up to suppress him. He was dissecting the attack, removing the most dangerous elements with surgical precision. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of the battle. A man who should have been cowering was dominating the battlefield. He was the heresy incarnate, a healer, dealing death on an industrial scale. And as the sun began to rise, higher, illuminating the carnage on the Tanapag plain, Captain Benjamin Salomon dug his boots into the coral grit, gritted his teeth, and prepared for the final act. The abyss had opened up to swallow him, but he had decided that if he was going down, he was going to choke the throat of the beast on his way out. The slaughter was just beginning. The sun rose over the Tanapag plain, not as a beacon of hope, but as a harsh spotlight on a slaughterhouse. Captain Benjamin Salomon saw only the iron sights of the Browning machine gun, his vision tunneled into a monochrome world of gray smoke and muzzle flashes. His world narrowed to a 30-degree arc of fire, a killing zone where he was the sole arbiter of life and death. The initial shock of the assault had faded, entirely replaced by a grim endurance fueled by adrenaline and the survival instinct of a cornered animal. The heat from the receiver radiated into his chest, soaking his tunic with sweat that stung his open wounds, mixing with the grime and blood of the morning. The vibration of the heavy weapon became a constant jackhammer against his skeleton, rattling his teeth in his skull until his jaw ached, but he did not let go of the spade grips. He had ceased to be a man in the conventional sense. He had become a biological component, fused to the steel, essential for its operation, the wetware processor for a machine of industrial death. He watched the enemy regroup in the tall grass, coordinating their movements to find blind spots in his defense. They popped up to fire snapshots that whizzed past his head like angry insects, cracking the air with the sonic boom of passing lead. Salomon tracked them, learning the rhythm of the weapon, depressing the muzzle to skip rounds off the hard coral rock and ricochet them up into the soft flesh of the attackers, turning the very terrain against them. The isolation was absolute. He was entirely alone on the line. The wounded had evacuated successfully, their lives, bought and paid for, with every belt of ammunition he expended in these precious minutes. He checked his shrinking supply. At the cyclic rate of the Browning, which devoured 600 rounds every 60 seconds, the remaining crates represented mere moments of sustained hate. He could not afford the luxury of suppression fire. He disciplined his trigger finger, switching from long bursts to short controlled tattoos, targeting specific threats with a terrifying economy. A Japanese officer waving a katana urging his men forward. A machine gun team struggling to set up a nambu behind a fallen palm tree. Salomon prioritized them based on immediate lethality, applying the cold diagnostic logic of dentistry to the battlefield. He identified the infection, the most dangerous elements of the enemy formation, and drilled them out with 30 caliber bullets traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The acoustic environment was a solid wall of concussion, composed of outgoing thunder and incoming fire impacting the sandbags around his pit. Disaster struck when a stray bullet smashed into the water jacket of the gun, punching a jagged hole through the steel cylinder. Steam hissed violently, a scalding jet that threatened to obscure his vision and overheat the barrel within seconds. If the barrel warped, the gun would seize, and he would be dead. Salomon did not panic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of medical gauze, the same material he used to pack the wounds of his patients. He jammed the fabric into the bullet hole, using the tip of a bayonet to tamp it down into the boiling water. The heat seared his fingers, blistering the skin instantly, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on the mechanics of survival. The leak slowed to a manageable trickle. The gun kept firing. He kept the beast alive through sheer force of will, bridging the gap between healer and killer with a piece of bloody cotton. The crucible tightened around him. The enemy, realizing a frontal assault was suicide, began to work around his flanks, forcing a decision of suicidal bravery. The Browning 1917 A1 is a static defensive weapon weighing nearly 100 pounds with its tripod and coolant. It is not designed to be moved by one man under fire. Yet Salomon ceased fire, unlatched the traverse, and physically dragged the heavy gun across the uneven ground. The tripod legs dug into the coral, resisting him, but he hauled it 10 yards to the right, repositioning it to cover a shallow ravine just as a Japanese squad emerged from the cover. The surprise was total. The lead rounds cut them down at point-blank range, throwing them backward into the ditch they had just climbed out of. Salomon didn't stop there. He dragged the gun back to the center, then to the left, constantly shifting his firing position, making the enemy believe there were multiple defenders manning a reinforced line. He was a one-man battalion guarding a perimeter that existed only in his refusal to yield. Then came the slaughter. Infuriated by the delay and the mounting casualties, the Japanese command ordered a general charge. Hundreds of soldiers rose from the earth like a pestilence, a sea of bayonets and screaming faces that filled the horizon. There was no need to aim anymore, only to feed the gun. Salomon held the trigger down, abandoning all discipline for pure volume of fire. The water in the jacket boiled away completely, the steam venting into the air. The barrel began to glow a dull cherry red in the daylight, the metal expanding and smoking. The stream of lead became a solid bar of destruction, collapsing the front ranks of the charge into a gruesome rampart of flesh. Still, they came climbing over the bodies of their comrades, driven by a fanaticism that defied all logic of self-preservation. Salomon was shouting a primal roar that was lost in the thunder of the exploding cordite. He fired into the mass bullets, tearing through 2 or 3 men at a time, such was the density of the target. The air around him was thick with lead. A round took him in the shoulder, spinning him around with the force of a sledgehammer, but he pulled himself back up to the gun one-handed. Another round shattered his femur, snapping the bone, but he locked his knee and stood his ground, balancing on his good leg. He knew he was dying. The blood pooled in the bottom of the foxhole, mixing with the hot brass casings, but his mind remained lucid. He was the gatekeeper of hell, and he was denying them passage. The belt ran dry, and the bolt locked back with a hollow metallic clack that signaled the end. Salomon reached for a box, but grasped only empty air. The gun was dead. In the sudden, terrifying silence, he looked up to see the enemy 5 feet away. The wave crashed over the gun pit, but the dentist was not finished. He stood on his ruined leg, drawing his .45 caliber service pistol. He fired point-blank into the faces of the attackers, emptying the magazine in seconds. When the pistol clicked empty, he threw the heavy steel weapon at them and grabbed a bayonet from the ground. He fought with hands, feet, and teeth, a feral animal cornered and lethal. He drove the blade into a chest before the sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed him. Captain Benjamin Salomon died, not as a doctor, but as the deadliest soldier on the island of Saipan. Silence eventually returned to the Tanapag Plain. When the American counterattack reclaimed the ground, days later, men found a scene that silenced even the most hardened veterans of the Pacific Campaign. The body of Captain Salomon was draped over the machine gun he had manned to the end. In a semicircle in front of him lay the bodies of 98 Japanese soldiers, stacked in windrows like cordwood. Inside the medical tent behind him lay more dead enemies, indicating a ferocious close-quarter struggle before he even reached the gun. The story of his final moments was written in scars on his own body. He had been shot 76 times. The autopsy revealed that 24 of those wounds were suffered while he was still alive and operating the gun. He had absorbed enough lead to kill a squad of men, yet he had kept pulling the trigger until his heart stopped beating. The men of the regiment who had mocked him for his clean hands now looked at the 98 dead enemies and realized they beheld a warrior without peer. The regimental commander immediately recommended Captain Salomon for the Medal of Honor. It seemed a certainty, but the recommendation was rejected on a cold technicality. The Geneva Convention classified medical personnel as non-combatants, forbidding them from taking up arms for offensive action. The bureaucrats in Washington argued that manning a heavy machine gun violated his protected status, ignoring the reality that he had defended helpless patients against a massacre. They saw a rule book where there was only blood and survival. The recommendation was denied. For decades, Benjamin Salomon became a ghost, a footnote in the history of the Battle of Saipan. The injustice sat on the books, like a stain a paper shield used to deny a hero his due. but the story would not die. In the 1990s, a group of researchers dug up the original files and autopsy reports. They argued tirelessly that once the enemy violated the sanctity of the Red Cross, the doctor had every moral and legal right to become a combatant. Finally, in 2002, 58 years after his death, the mistake was corrected. President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to Dr. Robert West, representing the Salomon family, in a ceremony that bridged the gap of half a century. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon remains the only dentist to ever receive the Medal of Honor. But the medal does not say dentist, it says soldier. His legacy is not in the teeth he fixed, but in the terrible, beautiful calculation of his final act. When the abyss stared at him, he stared back through the sights of a machine gun. When the world demanded he be weak, he chose to be the wall against which the wave broke. He sleeps now in the soil of the country he defended, leaving behind the legend of the day. The healer became the reaper, and the dentist killed 98 men.